Hello, everyone. You probably know who I am, but just in case, this is Dr. Ralph Stevens, and I want to give you a brief introduction to Romanticism. Now, as you can probably see, I am working from a document here called Characteristics of Romanticism, and you can find this at the course website in Blackboard under Course Documents. So if you would like to get your own copy to follow along during this short lecture, please put me on pause, go get a copy, and then we will resume. All right, you're back. So, characteristics of Romanticism. First of all, I want to talk about the word itself. The words Romanticism and Romantic period, Romantic poet, Romantic literature, and so on, that does not mean romantic in the common sense of romantic meaning having to do with love or with being in love, hearts and flowers, Cupid's Valentine's Day, having love affairs, being in love, and so on, your sweetheart, etc. No. And it does not mean romance as in a love affair. The word romantic comes from the word romance, all right, which comes from the word Roman as in referring to the Roman language. Let me explain. The Roman language originally is Latin. It's the language of the Roman people, of the Roman Empire, for example. The languages then that are derived from Latin, such as French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and so on, those are the Roman languages. So where does romance come in? A romance during the Middle Ages, say somewhere around the 12th, 13th century, just to give you an idea of historical period we're talking about, a medieval romance was a story written in the Roman language, mostly French. So we see an example of something that is derived from the medieval romance in that poem La Belle Dame sans Merci, what I'm calling here Keats's Knight, the Knight at Arms, who tells the story of his encounter with the beautiful lady and so on. All right, that has characteristics of what we call the medieval romance. A romance is not a love affair. A romance is simply a story written in the Roman language. So we, in this course, are reading literature from the Romantic period, which means literature written in English and also in what we call British literature, that is literature from the British Isles, England, Scotland, Wales, and so on, from about 1785 to about 1830. Who are the Romantic writers? Well, you know some of them already because we've been reading them. We're studying them in the first unit of British literature too. So we've got Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats. There are others, but these are the ones that we study. Romantic poets, Romantic writers. But notice that I've repeated the name Shelley here. Why? Because there is another very important Shelley. She is Mary Shelley. She is the wife of Percy Shelley, the author of our poem Ode to the West Wind. And guess who Mary Shelley is? She is the author of a work that you've all heard about, whether you know it's a novel or not, and that is the novel Frankenstein. The novel about the scientist Victor Frankenstein, who makes the famous monster from body parts. Another very important Romantic writer. What are the characteristics then of Romantic literature, Romantic poetry in particular? First of all, the Romantics, and again, I'm not talking about people in love, the Romantics as in Romantic poets, were reacting to tradition and convention. They were, in that sense, they were revolutionizing literature. So they were revolutionary. And I think as we go along, you might get some idea of why they were and how they were revolutionary. But they were reacting to tradition and convention, not only in society in general, but in particular in literature. The Romantic writers, by and large, at first, were big supporters of the great revolutionary movements of the 18th century, the American Revolution, and in particular the French Revolution. They were all in favor of what we think of as equal rights. They were in favor of the advancement of the common people and so on. So they supported revolutionary movements, and they also supported revolution in literature. So, moving along, their focus in their work was the individual, and not just the individual in general, but the individual alone rather than the individual in the community. So we see a lot of individuals in the state of solitude, being alone rather than being among people, we might say, in society. So, for example, Wordsworth in Lines Composed Above Tintern Abbey, he's alone. The speaker in that poem, who is Wordsworth, he is setting himself out in the country. He is looking at the landscape. He is looking at the farms, the cottages and so on around him. He's looking at the trees and the meadows and the hills. He is alone. He is in the state of solitude. Example of the individual alone. There is then an emphasis on individual experience, specific individual experience, as opposed to the experience of people in community, the experience of communities. Let me give you a very familiar example. Experience of people in community would be something like the American Civil Rights Movement. But if we were focusing upon the struggle of an individual, his own particular struggle in the civil rights movement, say a Rosa Parks or a Martin Luther King, if we were writing specifically about that individual, then that would be an example of what we mean by individual experience. And when then we are looking at individual experience in Romantic literature, there is an emphasis on feeling. That is, what the individual is feeling as part of that experience, feeling over what we might think of as rational thoughts. So again, there is then also an emphasis on imagination versus reason. Imagination was an extremely important faculty, or we might think of as an ability or a function of the human mind, extremely important to the Romantics. They saw imagination as superior to reason in the act of what we might think of as creation. So, let me explain that in a minute when we get to this emphasis on the particular object. Emphasis on the particular object as opposed to the generalized category of objects. So if you look, for example, at Coleridge's Frost at Midnight, well, one of the central objects there is that piece of soot that he sees on the fireplace. He is looking at a specific fire, a specific part of that fire. He's not looking at fires in general, and he's not writing about fires in general, right? So that emphasis on the particular object and then on the imagination, let's put those two together. The Romantic writer was not concerned so much with imitating objects in general from what we call reality, All right, I don't mean that the romantic writer was not interested in reality. He certainly was, or she, very much interested in reality, but the tradition in literature up to this point had been that literature was essentially an imitation of what we see in reality. For the Romantic writer, literature was less a mirror, a reflection of what we see in reality, than what the mind imagines when it responds to that specific object. And very often, then, those objects are objects in nature rather than objects in human society. So, for example, Shelley's West Wind in that Ode to the West Wind, an object in nature. Shelley also has a poem called Mont Blanc, which is inspired by a mountain in the Swiss Alps, all right? So he is reflecting then upon that object and then not simply describing that object in a mirror-like way, but describing the influence of Mont Blanc, the white mountain, if you will, upon his imagination. So the poet then is an inspired individual. Think of Blake. Think of Songs of Innocence and Experience. The voice of the bard. All right, the bard then is the poet on a large scale, as a speaker, a prophet, somebody who is announcing something important, telling an important story. Bard in that sense. All right, so the bard then, and we'll talk a little bit more about the bard in a second, but let's just look at finally an important characteristic of Romantic literature is the influence of nature, both nature with a lowercase n, that is the objects in the natural world, and then nature with an uppercase N, meaning the spirit or the force that one senses in the natural world, the spirit of nature. Let's get back to the bard, because I like this quotation here, the elevation, what I'm calling the elevation of the poet. And this is from Peck and Coyle, A Brief History of English Literature. And they write, this is a typical stance in Romantic literature, that the writer detaches his or herself from received ideas and values, meaning standing apart from the traditional and conventional, standing apart from community, standing apart from society. That's the bard. All right, that's all I have time for, folks, in this short lecture. I'm limited by my program to 15 minutes. So I will leave you to check out this document, and you can see through this list of the different styles and forms of Romantic literature, and then the different subject matters that Romantic poets write about. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in discussion.